Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Urgency of Biodiversity Action from the Natural History Museum. I'm Khalil Thurlaway. Today's show is part of a new program this year called Our Broken Planet, How We Got Here and Ways to Fix It, that will combine live events, online content, and a display opening up at the museum later this year. You can keep up to date on our website and social media channels. Over the next hour, we're going to explore some fundamental aspects of how we see our society's relationships with nature. And we do love hearing your input as well. So if you've got any questions or comments, please do pop them in the comment section and we'll try to come to as many as we can in the time we've got. Please do keep it polite though. We're here to have an open discussion about some really important issues. If you enjoy the show, please do consider making a donation if you can using the donate button next to the chat. We are a charity and community support is really important to us. And I see that we've actually already had an anonymous donation coming in. Thank you so much. So without further ado, let's have a look at what we're talking about today. What sorts of things normally come to your mind when we say words like rich, valuable, wealthy? Most of the time we use these words, we're talking about material wealth, like money, property, industry. Accumulating and growing material wealth has been the driving force of capitalist societies for as long as we can remember. More recently, we've been realizing that this approach has caused serious damage to the world we live in and the living things we share it with. We know we're destroying our world, but we keep failing to actually take meaningful, coordinated global action to change course. There have been some small victories on the way, but we seem to have trouble scaling things up. Why is this? The UK government recently commissioned an independent review by Professor Dasgupta, a renowned economist, to look at this exact question. A big part of the problem is that living within the limits of what the planet can support is often deemed less profitable than the way we've been living so far. And Dasgupta suggests that when we talk about value and growth, we're actually doing our sums wrong and missing out big chunks of our wealth that could change the balance of how we interact with the world around us. To help us unpack this idea, I've got two guests with me today, Andy Purvis and Adriana de Palma, biodiversity scientists at the Natural History Museum who have, along with colleagues at the museum and beyond, published a report to support the Dasgupta review, which looks more closely at the benefits of implementing these changes right now, rather than delaying even further than we have already. So let's welcome Andy and Adriana. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi.
Hi, Khalil. Thanks for having us.
I'm really glad we get to talk about such a big, important thing. So to start us off, Adriana, why don't we give our audience a bit of an introduction to where the Dasgupta review came from and what it's for?
So the Dasgupta review really is about emphasizing the importance of biodiversity. So it highlights how economic sustainability and environmental sustainability are really tightly linked. And, that's not often appreciated. So I think, one of the big points of the Dasgupta review is that it shows us that, if we're protecting our environment, we're essentially protecting ourselves and our future.
And one of the words that we're going to be using a lot today is biodiversity. And it's a word that is used a lot, but it might not be 100% clear what we really mean by it. So why don't you unpack that term as well?
Sure. So biodiversity is, it is complicated because it encompasses the variety of life. So all variety. Often when we talk about biodiversity, people are thinking about species, so the number of species, so from beetles to elephants to orchids to fungi. But that's not the only aspect of biodiversity. Within each of those species, you'll have diversity of genes and diversity in the way that they interact with their environment. And all of that is part of the variety of life and so of biodiversity.
And as you said, this discussion brings together our views of kind of biodiversity and climate science with things like economics and policy making, which
Absolutely.
I guess is key to really solving such a complicated problem.
Yes, so it's bringing together these different fields so that we can actually make a global impact, I think. So it's not just biodiversity sciences or economics, it's bringing economics, biodiversity, policy, land use change, all of those aspects together to make some, informative decisions, hopefully, in the future. So this report can kind of support those decisions.
And we're trying to bring them together because they've kind of been quite disparate recently. And I guess that's part of how we got to this situation. But Andy, How did we get to this problem?
So you're right that they've been sort of ships sailing further and further away from each other, which is not how economics started, but economics has over the last couple of centuries become more and more theoretical, more and more deeply embedded assumptions, and increasingly using money as a shorthand for everything that matters. And so the focus has been on monetary measures of how countries are doing, how organizations are doing. So, for instance, GDP, gross domestic product, is the most commonly used single number as an indicator of how well a country is doing, and governments are under a lot of pressure to grow GDP. The trouble with doing that is it only measures financial activity. It measures only those things that have a price and a value in the marketplace, economic activity. It doesn't measure other kinds of activity. So, for instance, just within families, it doesn't include care given by one family member to another, but it also doesn't include anything about how the web of life, that biodiversity that Adriana was talking about, how that acts as a safety net and supports us and kind of looks after us. So the danger is, if pursuing GDP is the overriding objective, you can run down those other kinds of capital, the human capital and the natural capital, because your eye is too tightly focused on one measure.
And Adriana, what impact is this kind of focus on financial and material capital over natural and human capital? What impact is that having on us and on our future?
Yes, well, as Andy was saying, focusing on GDP, it often focuses on the products that we make, without really taking account of the environmental cost of producing those products. So when we're paying for something, we're often not paying that full price. And so in essence, we end up stealing resources from the world at large, from other living creatures, and from our future. And often the people that are worst affected by this environmental degradation that happens when we focus purely on products without thinking of the pollution, the cost of creating those products, it's actually poorer people, both within and across countries, that tend to suffer the most when we degrade the habitats to this extent.
So now that we're in this situation where we've saddled present poorer people and future everyone and other living organisms with the kind of the burden and the debt of our consumption, what's the kind of path towards changing that?
Sure. So I think clearly we need to move forward in a more sustainable way. So thinking about having the polluter paying. So if you're degrading the environment to produce a product, that environmental degradation should be taken into account. So in the future, we need to work towards not damaging the environment so much, of course, so environmentally sustainable practices. But that alone isn't really enough, because we've degraded our planet to such an extent. So we also need to work to undo some of the damage that we've already done. And
so that's the fact that we need to stop damaging things so much and also fix some of the damage that we've done is at the kind of core of how we want to approach this. But then if you extend that into how we're going to implement that within the current systems we live in, Andy, what does the Dasgupta review say about how we integrate that environmentally centered approach to economics and policy?
So Partha Dasgupta's review makes clear that this is not simple. He likens it to the Marshall Plan that was used to kind of rehabilitate the industrial economies of Europe after World War II. It's of that kind of scale, because at the moment our economies are geared towards industries that aren't particularly nurturing of natural capital. They're not on a sustainable model. So his review estimated that around $5 trillion a year go into subsidizing environmentally damaging industry. And so that's making things worse for future generations. It's a deliberate, admittedly unthinking choice to do that. That sort of investment instead in industrial practices, management practices that rebuild natural capital, that improve the health of the world's ecosystems, will make an enormous, a huge difference. But it's clear, as Adriana says, that this is beyond choices we make to become more conscious consumers, important though those are. Choices that we make in our business life to tread on the planet more lightly, important though they are. We need governments to act. And Sir Partha's review makes really clear that the world's governments have to be taking a lead, because they are the only organizations with the position that enables them to change how businesses operate by requiring this kind of environmentally aware accounting that Adriana was laying out.
I think you've hit on two really important points there, Andy. I think the first is that this is a problem that has been created and affects us all on a lot of scales, and so the solution is going to involve coordination across a lot of scales, whether it's all the way from the individual scale, organizational, governmental, and then intergovernmental. And if any of those parts of the chain are missing, it's going to weaken our response, and it's going to make it much harder to fix this. And another point you made that I quite like is that you use the word choice, and a lot of the activities of people and organizations in capitalist societies are framed in senses of it's a choice, it's a marketplace, but actually those operate within a wider system, and we can control the parameters of how those systems work and incentivize or disincentivize certain choices.
That's right. So at the moment, we'll often be making our choices on the basis of getting a bang for our buck. And we don't need to change that as long as we do the accounting correctly, as long as we actually level the playing field in terms of how sustainable or unsustainable the things are that we want, so that we do consider the full environmental cost. So it can be cheaper for me, but for COVID, which obviously puts a different spin on things, it would be cheaper for me to fly to Scotland than to catch a train. It's much more damaging for the planet, but there's no tax on aviation duty. So flying is actually, despite the fact it's environmentally hugely damaging, it's subsidized compared to other kinds of transport. If governments change policies like that, then I can continue to make the decisions based on what gives me the best return on my money, but I'll be making sustainable decisions rather than unsustainable choices. And we need help. Basically, acting in a sustainable way shouldn't be an act of altruism. It should be self-interest. But because of the way that our financial system has become decoupled from its environmental costs, those two things aren't very well aligned anymore.
And I guess, people are often going to act in their short-term interest. So get the cheaper ticket, get the cheaper, more accessible food or whatever. But, it's almost like a tension between short-term and long-term interest, because we are, cutting off our long-term nose to spite our face.
That's right. So we have to have systems that aren't just delivering today, but are resilient. So one of the lessons of the last year with the COVID pandemic, for instance, is that some economies that various countries had made were false economies, because they made their public health systems much less able to deal with new and foreseeable threats. Couldn't know exactly when they were coming, but it wasn't a surprise to anyone that they're actually was a pandemic at some point. And actually, the way we use land makes them more likely. So we need to take a long-term view in deciding what is good value and what isn't.
And I can, I can hear the little devil's advocate in my head saying, yeah, this is all well and good, but can we do this? Are there any examples where we have in the past coordinated in a kind of international way to change a very profitable capitalist enterprise in a way that leads to long-term environmental benefit?
Certainly, and it's a fair question. I understand the cynicism. I spend a lot of my time being cynical myself, but two examples I'll give you just briefly. One, the more recent one, is the banning of CFCs, which were widely used in aerosols and refrigerators and so on, but were very damaging for the ozone layer. Within a few years of the damage becoming clear, there were global agreements, and now they're just not used. And then the second example is obviously much more personal to us at the Natural History Museum, and that is the near global international ban on commercial whaling, which took species like the blue whale, the largest animal that's, as far as we can tell, ever lived on the planet, from the brink of extinction. So here's one we prepared earlier. So this is Hope, the blue whale, hangs in Hintzer Hall in the Natural History Museum. And this was a specimen that beached, but at a time when there was still commercial hunting. But then in the middle of the 20th century, the plight of whales rose to prominence, and global action stopped commercial whaling, and now the numbers have recovered. And we therefore have not lost the biggest creatures ever on Earth. And without that action, by now, they would have died out. So yeah, it can work.
And it is really heartening to see that, on an international scale, we can, when we get our act together, we can make up for some of our past mistakes. And that's why Hope is called Hope. She wasn't born called Hope. She symbolizes hope. And so now that we've had a bit of background to kind of the review and the context of it, let's go to a few audience questions before we look at where your work fits into this. We've had a question from Katie on Facebook, who's asking about ways that we could introduce this in kind of local government. And she says that habitat is not a category in planning departments in local authorities. For example, tree loss and designated conservation areas. Trees and designated conservation nations are, but biodiversity isn't. Surely changing this is the first is an important first step in this process.
So I think to some extent, biodiversity is considered in some planning decisions. Like you say, if, for instance, you're going to try and go over an ancient woodland or an area of particular biodiversity interest, you have to make a good case for that, and you have to then replace the biodiversity that you've lost. But I think planning policy still has some way to go in that area, because replacing what you've lost is a really difficult thing to do, because it takes a long time to even see the extent of the damage you've caused, never mind undo that damage in a different area. So yes, I think incorporating biodiversity more broadly in planning decisions would be absolutely excellent. And of course, there's really easy wins that you could gain in planning decisions in urban areas. So, incorporating nature a little bit more in urban planning could be really beneficial, both for biodiversity and also for people, because you get that tighter link between people and nature. So yes, absolutely. I think you're right that incorporating biodiversity in planning decisions is really going to be a win-win situation if it's done properly.
And we've had a question from one of our viewers on YouTube who's asking whether past kind of global collaborations, for example, action on whaling, do you think that could be a good kind of template for how we coordinate future responses?
It's a really good question. There are different views on how best to coordinate the responses of different countries. One of the difficulties that international agreements have on biodiversity and on climate is it's not quite clear who's in charge of holding to account any countries that renege on their commitments. And so this is, I think, a place where the broader public have a really important role to play in terms of holding governments, but also companies who don't act to account. So one of the biggest changes in the last decade or so in terms of sort of green politics, if you like, has been reputational damage that organizations that act in bad faith have suffered. And that is a way of trying to increase the chances of international agreements sticking, so that those who sort of fall behind on their commitments are held up and shown to be doing so. But there's also a need to move away from thinking in terms of the environment and economies being opposed. And so any step towards a more sustainable future being viewed as negative in the other way, because it really isn't. If we can just undistort our perspective, living more sustainably is actually a future that we would prefer. You know, our daily lives would be better. It isn't that it's detracting from the quality of life, it's an addition. So there's a need to shift that mindset in governments and everybody.
Yeah, I think that's really important, both of those points about accountability being really key to enforcing agreements, but also, yeah, changing people's mindsets, especially in kind of organizational governmental levels, away from sustainability being a kind of punitive stick and towards a carrot of actually a world where we can still have a great quality of life, and arguably a better one, like you said. We're going to have one last question, and then we're going to move on to look more closely at the report that you guys have put out. So Lexi on YouTube has asked, do you feel that the new UK HAB classification and required biodiversity metric calculator is enough? It seems like a good start. So to answer that, would one of you mind unpacking what the new UK HAB classification is? Are either of you aware of that?
I guess HAB is habitat.
I assume so.
Yeah, so I saw some information on the biodiversity metric calculator a while ago. I'm probably not up to date on it. Any start is a good start. So there is probably, there is definitely an absolute best way forward. But because we're so far from that at the moment, then steps in broadly the right direction should just be welcomed. And as long as we track the progress, as long as we see what the effects are and learn as we go, then we can refine that finer direction as we go along. So anything that moves us in the right direction is great. We mustn't let the better be the enemy of the good here. Yeah,
that's so often a stumbling block with environmental work and a lot of other work that's trying to improve the world, that, you know, we're all arguing over what direction is the best direction, that we don't take steps in a good direction. Thank you so much. We've had some really good questions about other stuff, but we're going to come to them later in the show. So now I think it's really important that we look at the report that you guys have worked on. So Adriana, how does this fit into the wider discussion we've been having about the Dasgupta review, and what was your report saying?
So, you know, as I said before, the Dasgupta review is really about the importance of biodiversity, but what we were looking at was the urgency. So how important is it that we act now rather than delaying for another 10 years. So what we did was to assess how biodiversity might respond to our efforts to stabilize biodiversity. So if we do nothing, we just continue as we are and continue with the biodiversity policies that we've got in place already, biodiversity will, continue to decline. But if we act right now, if we make, ambitious, immediate action, then that really is best for biodiversity and also for our pockets. So delaying by 10 years it will make it twice as expensive to support biodiversity to the same extent as if we, made actions right now.
And that graph that we can see right now, that's not from your report, but it does illustrate some of the points we're talking about, which is that the longer we don't act, the longer we stay on that bottom gray line in decline. And the lower that goes, the harder it's going to be and the more expensive it's going to be and the less effective it's going to be to try and recover. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and it also shows nicely that there's no single thing we can do that will take us from the grey line to the green line. It's going to need a raft of different measures, different policies, a set of wedges, if you like, to bridge between the future we don't want, and which is the track that we're on, and the positive future, that sort of nature positive transition that we would like to see. So we've considered in our report one such wedge, which is the restoration of natural forest and also improved protection of existing natural forest. But it's not the only ecosystem. Marine ecosystems, freshwater ecosystems and wetlands are also hugely important for carbon as well as biodiversity. But we focused on reforestation because it does have that extra benefit, as well as forest being where lots of species are habitat specialists and only narrowly distributed, so they're endemics, critically dependent on their bit of forest. Also, forest is one of the most carbon-rich ecosystems. So we want to draw down as much carbon as we can from the atmosphere over the next few decades, not as an alternative to moving out of fossil fuels as quickly as we can, but as an extra wedge to fight against climate change.
And I think it's really interesting that you mention all these other ecosystems, because I know for a fact there's a lot of really interesting work going on in terms of coral restoration, because obviously that's another massive hotspot for biodiversity and really important in global food webs, but it's being really badly damaged by climate change and pollution. So yeah, I think it's fascinating that, even by looking at one ecosystem, so you're looking at forest restoration, this approach can be broadened out and applied in a lot of different circumstances.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, interesting that you raise corals, because they're a particularly concerning ecosystem, because it looks as though we're, the best case scenario, they're going to be quite close to the tipping point. If we have a 1.5 degree rise in shallow sea temperature above the pre-industrial mean, then 10 to 15% of existing tropical corals will be okay. But if it goes much above 2 degrees, then we're expecting less than 1% of the world's shallow tropical reefs to be able to persist.
And I think that really goes to underscore the urgency of what we're talking about, because there are some doodles that can't be undid. There are some of these changes that are going to be very hard to remedy. And I think a key way to get these changes, like you were saying, is change at large and small scale, at governmental, individual, everything in between. Because there are going to be some, we talk a lot about, things are going to collapse and these really big apocalyptic changes, but there are some very immediate changes that people will see in their lives. For example, food prices. Adriana, I think we've got a graph here from the report that you guys put together. Why don't you talk us through this?
So essentially, if we delay action, so if we wait another 10 years before we start implementing the changes that we looked at, which is about protecting and restoring forests, then what will happen is that we'll need to take land out of agricultural production to make space for that new forest and new biodiversity. And when we take land out of agricultural production, we're going to drive those food prices up. And not only is that a bad thing in terms of economics, we would rather not have more expensive food, but that is also going to drive more of the inequality that we're already seeing both across and within countries. So poorer people are going to struggle much more to buy their food because it's going to be more expensive as a percentage of their household income. So again, delaying action, it's bad for our pockets, it's bad for biodiversity, and it's going to have impacts on food prices that we just don't want to see.
And I think these very immediate, tangible, individual level impacts, I think can really feed into something that was mentioned earlier, which is about the need for us to reconnect with nature. And that sounds like kind of a hippie thing, but what we really mean is people's relationships with nature. You only save what you care about. Andy, sorry.
No, absolutely. You're right. We do only save what we care about. One of the revelations over the last year has been the importance of access to nature in how resilient people are able to be with all the challenges that the COVID pandemic has thrown up. It's been immensely important to people's well-being, mental and physical health, that there is some green space, some ability to connect with nature. Because actually we do really value that experience. It shows the value of it, where the sort of narrow classical economics view has let us down is it's very hard to price that. And so in economics, it's kind of easy to count the money. The nature really counts, but doesn't get counted. And hopefully the Dasgupta review will change that trajectory and put us on a better track. And I mean, the museum has a project that's just beginning now, the Urban Nature Project, which is really trying to promote these connections between urban dwellers, because now most of the planet is most people in the world are living in cities. By 2050, it'll be over 2/3. And access to local nature and connection to local nature is just really important for well-being, physical health as well as mental health.
And you'd be surprised where you can find nature. You might not think that you have access to nature if you don't have a garden or a big park nearby, but life is all around us. And as was shown in that slide earlier, there are lots of resources on our website, especially the urban nature section, that can give you little tips and activities on how to restore or deepen your connection with nature. And there should be a link coming up in the chat soon. So now that we've established kind of the severity of the problem and the urgency of dealing with it, and how we can try and work our way towards a solution there, what are the next questions you want to ask? What are the next avenues of research for you, Adriana?
So there's a few things that we'd like to do. So as we were saying, in this project, we were looking at forests in particular, but there are a number of other different things that we can do to protect biodiversity. So changing the way that we manage the land around us. There are a number of options for that. So we'd like to really dig into that a little bit more and see how different management options will protect biodiversity now and how it might affect biodiversity into the future.
And also, I think it'd be really interesting to see how urban biodiversity starts to recover as we start investing in it, start working to try and green open spaces, and try and put more nature into our daily lives.
I think especially during the lockdown, people's access and no, people's relationships with stuff outside and nature and stuff, parks, things like that, has really become a bigger part of our lives, and hopefully we can work out how to kind of continue that trajectory. So I think now's a really good time to go to some more questions, because we've had some really, really interesting ones from our viewers. So Nicole has asked, what should we focus on when people keep degrading aspects of our natural environment, and how do we implement that focus? So it's a really big problem to tackle. Do we need to focus on particular environments or particular biomes, or do you think this approach will just have a blanket benefit?
So, when you're thinking about destruction in other areas of the world, it's easy to think of that as separate to you because it's so far away. But actually, the things that you consume here, so the products that you buy, the food that you eat, thinking about where that's produced and how it's produced can have a big impact. Because what's happened a lot in the past is that by importing goods that aren't very sustainably managed and sustainably produced, we've essentially exported our biodiversity damage. So if you think about deforestation in the Amazon, it's not as separate to you as you might think. So really trying to be a little bit more conscious about what you consume is a really important step. But also, there's a limit. You don't want to, I don't want people to be really stressed out about what they buy. And it is really difficult sometimes to decide what is the sustainable choice. So, another really big thing that we can do is to reduce our food waste. Because then even if some of our options aren't particularly sustainable, we're still reducing some of that damage by reducing the demand for them overall. And as I say, even though these are small individual changes, they can make a massive impact on biodiversity in the globe. I mean, a third of food is wasted globally.
So I completely agree with all of that. It's vital that we don't focus just on the UK biodiversity and set ourselves targets to improve biodiversity in the UK while causing lots of damage elsewhere in the world as a result of exporting that damage. Definitely reducing our waste, and we don't want. Yeah, it would be easy to get into a sort of situation of it becoming a trial, a really difficult way to live if you try and live in a way that's biodiversity and carbon neutral. But you can try year on year to reduce your footprint on the planet. So if you were to reduce your meat consumption by 10% a year, say, so that's like maybe 1 meal fewer a week this year, 2 meals fewer next year, then that builds up and makes a huge difference. And also we can be more conscious consumers generally and try and use suppliers who are trying to do the right thing and actually work sustainably. That will, if enough people do that, it brings about a tipping point whereby the large companies then have to change their business models because they see that it works. So it's very hard to, for instance, boycott a large supplier because they won't notice. But if you reward companies that are doing the right thing with your custom, it makes a huge difference to them and will encourage others to take the plunge.
And you mentioned there kind of large and small businesses, and that feeds into a question we've had from Natalia, who asks, how can small businesses empower people to make positive change towards wildlife and biodiversity conservation? And I guess
Great
that
question.
is
Yeah.
a very tough question.
Yeah.
So there are a range of different carbon calculators, for instance. We don't yet have a kind of biodiversity calculator, but that would be a really good step as well. And there are moves afoot to try and produce them. So again, a business can try and move along the trajectory and try and encourage customers to move along the trajectory as well towards treading more lightly.
Yeah, I think so. There are some small companies that, you know, they provide more information because they can. They're smaller, so they can provide, you know, that little bit more information about environmental sustainability, rather than, you know, you see all these badges and logos are all around the place, and sometimes it's not obvious what they mean. So, you know, if there are smaller companies that can put a little bit more effort into, you know, giving more detail about the environmental sustainability of products, that could be really, really helpful for consumers, I think, in terms of making those decisions. Because I say what we want is for decisions to be as simple as possible. And as Andy was saying, you know, if we can make it so that the decision to be environmentally sustainable is also the best economic option, then that's ideal. But before we get to that point, because I think we do have a way to go before we get there, really making sure that consumers have the information that they need to make those choices would be the first step.
And I guess that's another place that governments can be involved helpfully, because, you know, I think we do need a bit more regulation around how terminology is used around sustainability and environmentally friendly products and stuff, because there's this whole greenwashing thing of, you know, products and services being labeled as sustainable, biodegradable, recyclable, ocean friendly, all sorts of different terms that are used. And some of them don't actually have a huge amount of clarity as to what they mean. And so it's easy to, sometimes it can be hard to know what to trust, what to believe.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially, so if you think of recycling, for instance, you know, it's not enough to just see that it's recyclable and think, oh, well, never mind, I'll buy that piece of plastic, because recycling has its own environmental costs. It has its own economic costs. You know, it's better than wasting and throwing it in a landfill site, but it's not as good as reusing something and, you know, not buying that item in the first place. So again, it can be a really difficult landscape. So I do, you know, appreciate that it can be very hard to make the right choice, but and obviously, and the right choice for one person isn't necessarily going to be the right choice for someone else as well. But providing, you know, more information, I think can be helpful for that.
Yeah. So as a parallel, there's now food labeling in a way that there didn't used to be, in terms of the ingredients in the food that might be allergens, and also in terms of just the nutritional information. It would be fantastic to have an environmental impact score on products as well. And then that would draw attention to those products that are more sustainable, those products that are less sustainable, and would highlight just how huge these, at the moment, unpaid costs occasionally are, that don't need to be anything like so great. It's just because we aren't having to pay them at all at the moment that no one tries to do more, or far too few organizations have tried to do things more sustainably.
And we've got loads and loads of really amazing questions coming in from our viewers, and I want to get to some more of those. But first, I'd like to look at some of the potential challenges we might see in the way of us accomplishing this kind of positive change, and how we might think about overcoming them. So, you know, there are a couple of challenges that might spring to mind. So, you know, for example, how do we decide on a kind of numerical value or weighting for how much we value natural and human capital? Because it's very easy to value material capital. It is what, you know, people will decide to pay for it. But if we're not buying nature or selling it, how do we understand how much it's worth?
Yeah, so there's a controversy in this area about the use. I used the term earlier, natural capital. The concern being that it's distilling nature down to an amount of money, and the concern is that the conversion. The concern largely is that the price put on it is much too low. And it's true that we can only estimate some parts of the value of nature. And so there are some of the benefits, the sort of spiritual benefits, for instance, that are much harder to monetize, much harder to work out how much they would be worth. So our estimates of the value that should be assigned to biodiversity tend to be too low. But at the moment, economics explicitly gives them a value of 0. And so I think it's better to be roughly right than exactly wrong. And at the moment, the value assigned to biodiversity in the calculus that's going on at the moment is exactly wrong. It's a very precise round number. And as a result, we are, selling the world far too cheaply.
And I guess there's a kind of a parallel or a related argument to that, which is, that if we're going to try and make urgent, immediate, significant change, then we're going to need the buy-in of governments and large corporations and things like that. And the language that they speak is in these large calculations and sums and stuff. And if we can't integrate natural and human capital into that, then we're not going to persuade them with arguments of, oh, but it's good. It's the good thing to do.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, there have been, big environmental changes. So when we see large-scale droughts, and we've been seeing more of them and more, severe than previously. So when we see these big, horrible changes in the world, we're also now seeing those economic impacts and the social, human impacts of those as well. So that's, obviously awful, but one of, at least, the horrible silver lining is that governments and companies are seeing that the environmental damage that we've been doing so far has real impacts on their bottom line and on the people that they're meant to be protecting and supporting and providing for. So I think there has been, momentum there, and companies are seeing environmental sustainability as, an integral part of their own economic security in the future, and governments are taking that on board as well. But again, these discussions have been going on for decades now, and as we were saying, this report really is trying to light a bit of a fire to say we have to make these actions now. But I do think that there has been more appreciation recently for how important biodiversity and the environment is. And so hopefully those decisions will be coming.
Well, it's like that old saying about the urgency is, if you think money's more important than the environment, try holding your breath while you count your money. So we've had a really interesting question from Lara on YouTube, who says that New Zealand recently abandoned gross domestic product as its primary measure of growth, and instead adopted an index of people, profit, and planet. What do you think about this? And do you think it's a good template to move forward with? And how close are we to potentially making this a kind of a more global approach?
I think it's a great lead. It's got those three elements that I mentioned earlier. It's got the capital we're used to thinking about, it's got the human capital, and it's got the natural capital in there. And yeah, if we're pursuing a future where all three of those things are doing well, then that's a future we can leave to our descendants with a clear conscience. So wouldn't be the only time in the last few years that New Zealand have got something really important about right. Yeah, looks great to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are definitely some lessons that we could learn from New Zealand in several respects. I mean, we can't put anyone on a pedestal because we're all making mistakes in some fields, but there have been some really, really interesting developments coming out there. So a question from Katie. Do either of you think that de-extinction and restoring lost species using kind of molecular genetic techniques will ever be an effective tool for restoring biodiversity that has been lost?
I don't know, but I think...
Obviously, we're not talking Jurassic Park here. We're talking
No.
about, recently lost species.
Yeah. I worry sometimes that the focus on that kind of thing will draw away focus from preventing the extinctions that we're having now. So it's a safety net, and it could potentially be useful, but I don't think we should work assuming that a safety net exists. I think we should focus on, because even if we can restore particular species, that's not enough. It's about interactions among species. It's about the habitats they exist in. So it's a very tiny piece, really, of everything that we've lost. And so, yeah, I would say that if we're going to make meaningful change, we have to accept that safety nets, haven't worked so far.
Well, it's like that same idea of there's an idea that I think is kind of dangerous of viewing Mars as a kind of a backup Earth. And not for a long time. It's going to take, if it's even possible, it's going to take a very long time and a lot of effort to make it livable. And B, we should not be trashing this house and then just assuming that we can move somewhere else. We should stop trashing our own house.
Absolutely. Yeah. And with de-extinction, I can't imagine that it would ever be the best use of the money. And also, lots of the species that I've seen touted as suggestions for it, if you managed to produce a newborn mammoth, for instance, it wouldn't have a clue what to do. So a lot of them are species where social culture will have been really important in their role in the ecosystem. And of course, there's no way of bringing that back. So species, Adriana mentioned this right at the start, they're one way of thinking about biodiversity, but it's more than a set of stamps. It's that species in its environment doing its thing. And de-extinction will, for lots of those animal cases anyway, cannot provide that.
And I think that that's really important to have that balance between, what we would love to do is to restore our environments to a kind of almost a kind of like I don't want to use the phrase Garden of Eden, but the kind of the pre-industrial state. But actually, there are, if we're pragmatic about it, there are some things that actually would be almost impossible to implement, like rewilding a mammoth. So it's, and I as well as that fits into this kind of approach as well. It's the pragmatism of using the system we've got and where we are now to try and have the large urgent change required, rather than worrying too much about kind of restoring an ideal.
Yep.
So I think we've got time for one or two more questions before we wrap up. And one question I wanted to ask is, one of the obstacles that we often see to converting discussion and promises of shifting mindsets into action is the status quo of rich and poor within and between countries and things like that. And whenever we look at environmental measures like the Kyoto Accords and things like that, and the Paris agreements, how certain can we be that we will go from one of our viewers described it as well-meaning hand-wringing to effective action?
It's a great question. We cannot be sure, but the UK has a fantastic position to be influential in this, in that we're hosting the Conference on the Parties on Climate at the end of this year. There's also the Biodiversity Conference of the Parties, so Convention on Biological Diversity Conference, coming up a bit before that, where, again, the UK has taken a leading role in discussions beforehand with the Leaders' Pledge for Nature that their Prime Minister unveiled a couple of months ago, where one of the things that's been impressive here is that there's sign up from across all the ministries. And similarly with the Dasgupta review, that wasn't commissioned by the Environment Department, that was commissioned by the Treasury. So it has the weight of government involved in it, rather than being an environmental concern siloed within an environment department that's effectively trying to arm wrestle with all of the other departments. So there's a sign of joined up approach to environmental problems, which is the only way it can be solved. And the UK has the opportunity to show real global leadership on this. And, I very much hope that that's what they'll do, because it really has to happen that the UK government and other progressive-minded governments take this forward. And as our report shows, urgently, 10 years will double how much we pay.
And I think you've hit something really interesting there, which is it's quite heartening to see that it was the Treasury that commissioned this. It's the money that cares. Adriana, do you have any closing remarks before we wrap up?
I'd like to kind of re-emphasize that although, the Dasgupta review and the report that we did as part of that was, thinking about biodiversity in this broad global scale. But I think I'd just like to re-emphasize that although it is a global problem, I mean, this is a planetary emergency, biodiversity loss is important to us all, but we can make small decisions in our own gardens, in our own balconies, in our own, as we consume things and buy products, thinking about how they're transported as well as produced. And those small decisions, I think, will grow to make big changes.
So we're not powerless at the small level, but we do also need big action at the top level.
Absolutely.
Everything in between. All right, I think that's a lovely place to leave it. Thank you so much, Andy and Adriana.
You're very welcome.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
And thanks to you at home for joining us as well. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. The discussion's been really great, and I hope that what we've talked about will serve as fuel for further conversations. Sorry if we didn't have time to get to your question. It's a short show. We've only got so much time, but I've really enjoyed seeing all the chat in the comment sections. Once again, massive thanks to those who've donated as well. If you do enjoy the show, please do consider making a donation. It's much appreciated, and it really helps us keep bringing you content like this. We've got more shows coming up in the Our Broken Planet series. Keep an eye on our website and social channels, and there should be a link coming up in the chat soon. In the meantime, there's a ton of other talks, shows, and videos on our YouTube channel, and you can stay up to date with what's going on at the museum on our Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook pages, as well as our website at nhm.ac.uk. Until then, I'm Khalil Thurlaway, that was Andy Purvis and Adriana de Palma, and this has been the Urgency of Biodiversity Action from the Natural History Museum. Goodbye.